There's been plenty of talk about bosses in From Software games over the last 15 years. Which ones are the best, which ones are the worst, which are the easiest and which are the hardest. There's even the occasional shout out to some underrated bosses, often a bone thrown to what the community likes to call gimmick bosses. Conversely, the topic of the most overrated bosses in these games is rarely brought up, and when it is, it almost universally derails into contrarianism for the sake of it, or non-arguments that boil down to I don't like it because I don't like it. Best case scenario, we get a genuine attempt at analysis that's prefaced by something along the lines of this boss is still great, just not the greatest thing ever. For something to be deemed overrated, it needs to be rated to begin with. It's easy to dismiss Dragon God, Bed of Chaos and the Prowling Magus, as not many people would stain their bastard sword defending these bosses. Throwing shade at the critical darlings is a whole different matter, and that's what we're doing today, unapologetically and backed with arguments. My most recent venture into Lothric was rather uneventful for the most part, until a faint feeling that's been with me since my very first playthrough came back with a thundering roar. And then I realized what that feeling was. I'd found the most overrated boss in the Souls series. Indeed, it is Dark Souls 3, the holy grail of Souls boss design, that hosts the biggest fraud on the boss roster of Demon Souls and its 3 not technically but kind of sequels. I did lie though. I didn't find the fraud in Lothric, I found it in a cold and lonely painted world. And since no one really cares all that much about the other boss in the Ashes of Ariandel DLC, you already know that I'm calling out Sister Friede, Father Ariandel and Friede, and Black Flame Friede.
I will snuff out these ashes for good.
And with this, we've already tackled the first issue with this boss. It has 3 phases that you must go through every single time you enter the fog wall. Friede is the first and last boss in the Souls series to include 3 separate phases, but what's much more important here is that each phase includes a vastly different moveset and obstacles you must deal with. This makes Friede unique in the worst way possible. She's the only occasion in any From Software game where you're basically required to beat 3 different bosses back to back. Dark Souls 2 has the endgame gauntlet of Throne Watcher and Defender, Nashandra and Aldia, but defeated bosses do not respawn on subsequent attempts. Even Elden Ring's incredibly dumb decision to link Radagon and Elden Beast isn't as bad from a purely mechanical standpoint. Friede's 3 phases require a different approach to fight efficiently, which wouldn't have been nearly as bad if the final phase wasn't by far the most difficult, if you didn't have to grind through the first couple of phases each time just to reach Black Flame Friede, and if it wasn't for the myriad of issues that plague this boss. To keep this analysis structured, I've split it in 3 parts, to match each phase, tackling their faults individually. Let's begin with Phase 1, Sister Friede. The first phase is the easiest by a significant margin. All Friede's attacks, with one notable exception, deal low to moderate damage, her combos are limited to 3 or 4 swings at most, she'll kill you before she would ever inflict you with Frostbite, and she would only occasionally pull out her Frost AoE. If this phase was all there was to this boss, Sister Friede would be among the easiest in Dark Souls 3. Yet being easy doesn't mean Phase 1 is spotless. The one highly damaging move I glossed over is a personal favorite of mine. Friede goes invisible and teleports around the arena, suddenly attacking you with a scythe slam that could kill you at lower vigor or if you weren't wise enough to chug an Estus while her body was on vacation. Teleportation in From Software games has never been pulled off right. Not in the Twin Princess fight from this very same game, not in the Radagon fight, and definitely not in the Friede fight. The devs tried to balance Sister Friede's Houdini routine by giving us a slight visual and sound cue to go off of, and fair enough, if you can consistently find her using those, that's a good deal of free damage. If you can't, then you're left with roll spamming and praying that she doesn't RKO you out of nowhere. Having 50-50 odds of getting in damage or getting hit for a ton of damage isn't my idea of engaging boss design. Another pet peeve of mine is Friede's tendency to cut distance to the player via gliding. This is present in all 3 phases and has become a staple in all subsequent From games, and I cannot begin to describe how stupid it looks. It is also one of the more understated methods by which FromSoft enhances difficulty and pushes the player into nothing but rolling. If the enemy can glide through the arena at will, Avoiding attacks by good positioning becomes nigh on impossible, so you'll have to roll regardless.
Return from whence thou camest.
On to phase 2. Father Ariandel and Friede is a dual boss that plays fundamentally different than the first phase. The enormous Father enters the chat with wide sweeps, heavy slams and fire AoEs, while Friede is content to take more of a backseat for this one, except not really. Friede relentlessly spams frost on the ground and will very much attack you if you get anywhere near her. Last but not least, she will try to heal her and Father Ariandel's combined health pool later on in the fight, so it's ill-advisable to ever lose sight of her. There's no denying that Friede not going for wombo combos unless provoked is a welcome reprieve, but she is often described as passive in this phase, which is the exact opposite of the truth. She is very much active in covering the floor with frost, which may not seem like much, but it significantly reduces your space and makes it so every mistake could be fatal. Father Ariandel's attacks are slow but heavily damaging, and he also likes to play a more traditional version of the floor as lava. Getting caught in Friede's frost while Ariandel is attacking you can and likely will bring out the "you died" screen. Phase 2 can be overwhelming in the traditional dual boss kind of way, where you must take note of two powerful enemies simultaneously. There's also the potential for cheap deaths at the hands of AoE spam, but Friede's teleportation no longer leads to a nearly undodgeable stab. There still aren't prolonged combos at play, and you get to whack away at the lumbering Ariandel instead of chasing the nimble Friede around the large arena. All in all, if the boss encounter ended here, it would have been a decent challenge, I'd say above average for Dark Souls 3, and mostly fair, with the glaring exception being Friede's disappearance act in phase 1, and to a lesser extent the AoE spam in phase 2. But of course... And so begins phase 3, Black Flame Friede. That reveal the first time through is genuinely one of the most memorable moments in Dark Souls 3, so credit where it's due. My praise for Black Flame Friede ends here though, I'm afraid. This phase, even by itself, would be among the toughest challenges in the game, but FromSoft somehow thought it perfectly reasonable to slot it behind an already decently challenging double gauntlet, which, I repeat, you have to go through every single time just to get a shot against Black Flame Friede. This is a bizarre design decision that doesn't make any sense mechanically or thematically. From a mechanical standpoint, forcing the player to claw through two bosses just for the opportunity to find the final and by far most difficult phase in a game all about learning enemy attack patterns and openings can only be described as artificial difficulty, which isn't even necessary because Black Flame Friede is hard enough by herself. Of course, she wouldn't be nearly as difficult if you could fight her straight away, but that's what artificial difficulty is. Fighting Sister Friede and Father Ariandel again and again doesn't contribute anything besides draining your resources, throwing your rhythm off and frustrating you because you want to fight Black Flame, not the same two enemies you've probably killed a couple dozen times already. These multi-phase shenanigans make no sense thematically either. Why would Father Ariandel, whom we just killed, be back in his chains each time we die to Black Flame? Why would Friede revert to her default nun skin each time we die to her powered up goth version? Why does any of this have to happen outside of making the fight more difficult for the sake of difficulty? Multiple phases are one of my biggest gripes with later From Software games, so much so that I may tackle them in a separate video at some point, but I hope you can see where I'm coming from here. But enough talk of prior phases, let's discuss Black Flame. Friede is the most agile boss in Dark Souls 3 right off the bat, but her acrobatics really take off in phase 3. Her leaps and dashes make the player character feel like it's glued to the floor. Making bosses faster than the player to enhance difficulty has been a thing since Artorias of the Abyss, but as with so many other things, it's taken to the extreme with Friede. The agility of a boss of relatively small stature wouldn't have been of much note if not for the rest of Black Flame Friede's arsenal. Her combos become longer and deadlier, her attacks deal obscene amounts of damage, and now have Black Flame effects for even more range and damage. And to make sure you can't easily punish her, FromSoft made sure Friede quickly dashes away after most of her attacks. Finally, if you felt like Friede's frost trails were a tad bit too frequent during phase 2, prepare for trouble and make it double, because she spams frost like there's no tomorrow in phase 3. Getting caught in the frost explosion will inflict frostbite, take a decent chunk off your health and send you flying in the air and onto the ground. Call it a skill issue if you like, but I can't help but feel like a fast enemy with long combos, a ton of damage, an easily applied status effect and a barrage of AoEs that can still go invisible, and as the third mandatory phase of a boss fight with 3 completely different movesets is a tad bit too much. Even the one point brought up for the fight being balanced, the fact you can stagger Friede with each hit, falls flat. It's something that she gets staggered, but so do you. This is Dark Souls 3, poise is non-existent. Even a Havel monster gets staggered every other hit. With how frantic the Black Flame phase is and how quick she is to jump away, you'd be lucky if you ever land more than one hit with anything slower than a dagger anyway, which makes the stagger mostly irrelevant. If you're still not convinced, allow me to introduce you to my final argument, Slave Knight Gale. Yes, arguably Dark Souls 3's most iconic boss, the last boss we may ever get to fight in the Souls series, is summonable for the Sister Friede fight. Well, not exactly. He isn't summonable for Sister Friede, as if From Software knew that the phases coming after her take the whole encounter above and beyond the average player's capabilities. Gale spawns during the Father Ariandel and Friede fight, and that's not even the most interesting aspect of this summon. It's also the only one in the entire series that can be summoned without the player being embered, or the various equivalents of this status across Souls games. Think of this. From Software were so convinced that you'll die to Friede again and again that they didn't want you spending embers on summoning Gale so you don't run out of them. Mind you, this is an easily obtained and easily farmable item that even subpar players should have dozens of by the time they reach Friede. I don't mind a decent challenge. Sekiro is one of my all-time favorites after all, and that game holds your hand less than any other From release. But I can't stand it when an objectively faulty encounter gets praised into high heaven solely because it's difficult. There's a reason Ishin is held in high regard and Demon of Hatred is not, despite them both being up there in terms of difficulty. It boggles the mind why Sister Friede, Father Ariandel and Friede, and Black Flame Friede, these 3 bosses lumped into one, are so often thrown together with the best of the best, when they are more akin to what Demon of Hatred is in Sekiro. An out-of-place, overtuned, borderline unfair fight that you must min-max for, or treat like a job for a couple of days, to the point where you know all about Father Ariandel's wild bachelor days in Irotil. Unlike the demon, which is at best divisive, Friede has gone down in history as one of FromSoft's best, which I find kind of funny, considering how she's pretty much the prototype for Elden Ring's Olympic gymnast-style bosses that caught a decent amount of flack for their long-winded, high-damage, AoE-filled combos and wild phase switches. Maybe it takes a game filled with Friedes to finally realize that the template wasn't all that great to begin with. If you're still here, first and foremost, thanks for watching. Changing someone's opinion, especially one they've probably held for nearly a decade, is a borderline impossible task, which is why I'm not trying to do that with this video. This is an attempt at a more objective analysis of what I consider the most overrated boss in Souls, but keep in mind that such an analysis will find some issues even with the best bosses in the series. Friede just so happens to be the one with the most issues among the highly rated boss encounters, or at least I think so. Everyone is still free to like her, by the way. I hated the Guardian Ape my first Sekiro playthrough, and I still think Genichiro and Emma Ishin's first phases are intergalactic levels of stupid, but I love fighting them regardless, so there's that. Liking something is all subjective, and we're all free to enjoy whatever it is that we enjoy. Some people love the sensation of defeating an enemy on their own terms, even if they've died 100 times to it, and even if the encounter is skewed against them slightly over the line of fairness. I talk more in depth about this phenomenon and gaming difficulty in general in a video you should be seeing on your screen right about now, so give that one a go if you're interested. Thanks again for sticking around, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more.